From the outset of the operation in Iraq, American soldiers search for Saddam Hussein's arsenal. They find nothing. The politicians blame it on the intelligence community.
You know, intelligence agencies frequently make mistakes. Intelligence organizations, by their very nature, are working with imperfect information, with conflicting accounts, with things that it's impossible to interpret with a high degree of certainty.
The CIA, which had been so suspicious of the collaboration between the exiles and the Pentagon, will be forced to take the blame, notably for the most blatant lies. That little sentence, 16 words in all, spoken by Bush about the African yellow cake and the documents that inspired it.
No one knew at the time in our circles. Maybe someone knew down in the bowels of the agency, but no one in our circles knew that there were doubts and suspicions that this might be a forgery.
This insistence on defending the official lie finally gets the better of Joe Wilson's discretion.
It was at that time that I fully understood that the government was not going to admit that it had lied to the American people, and therefore I had to write the story myself.
In the New York Times, he publishes the truth about his mission to Niger and the fact that the White House was well aware of his conclusions.
Given the structure of the consortiums that operated the mines, it would be exceedingly difficult for Niger to transfer uranium to Iraq.
The CIA must once again shoulder responsibility, and George Tenet releases a statement.
These 16 words should have never been included in the text written for the president. This was a mistake.
A small price to pay for a very lethal lie. At the White House, the issue becomes a subject of humor. Official inquiries will denounce the incompetence of the intelligence community for the erroneous information about Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction.
This was fraud, and I can't say that often enough. No mistake, fraud.
The man who was complicit in this deception refuses to be held solely responsible.
To believe that an exile organization with limited means can fool a major superpower, the only superpower in the world at the time, with tens of billions of dollars on sophisticated intelligence gathering into war against Saddam is fictional.
It will be 3 years before Bush admits that Saddam did not have WMDs.
The main reason we went into Iraq at the time was we thought he had weapons of mass destruction. It turns out he didn't, but he had the capacity to make weapons of mass destruction. But I also talked about the human suffering in Iraq.
Bush brushes aside the stated reason for a war that has destroyed an entire country. In Iraq, the invasion turns into a bloody occupation.
The downward spiral started with the occupation. The coalition, especially the Americans, lost the moral high ground, and they became the jailers of the Iraqi people.
The bedlam, the chaos, the violence in Iraq now is a natural consequence of what Bush and Cheney did in invading Iraq.
Iraq is quickly torn to shreds, ripped apart by religious and ethnic violence.
I think the most convincing argument was that in order to enhance Israel's position in the Middle East and its security, the nations surrounding it that formed an anti-Israeli bloc had to be broken up into smaller, confessionally homogeneous nation-states. So in the case of Iraq, a Kurdistan, a Shiistan, and a Sunnistan.
This objective was openly declared as early as 1996 in this document, signed by Richard Pearl and Douglas Feith, a text that accuses Iraq of posing a threat to Israel. Today, the chaos in Iraq has spread into Syria, entire provinces are beyond the control of Baghdad and Damascus. And the West has a new enemy, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, also known as Daesh.
The United States bears considerable responsibility for the fact that the Islamic State exists, but not because the United States intended to create the Islamic State, rather that the Islamic State came into existence as an unintended consequence of this immensely foolish war.
The Americans and the British, had they not occupied the country, had they curbed corruption when it started, we would not have Daesh.
The violence has claimed hundreds of thousands of victims, dead, wounded, maimed, and has uprooted millions of Iraqis and Syrians.
You have hundreds of thousands of refugees leaving the area, and nobody asks, what caused this? What caused this terrible human catastrophe? It wasn't an earthquake, it wasn't a typhoon, it was an invasion of a country that was reasonably intact when we invaded it.
The Iraqi deception has cost Americans almost $2 trillion, according to some estimates. Much of this public money has been directed to the defense industry.
Peace is bad for business. War, tension is always very good for business. So money, of course, was a major factor.
So the United States finds itself today essentially engaged in permanent war. And it's a permanent war that benefits some people. There are some people and some entities that are making a lot of money from this endless war.
Profits rarely mentioned, relegated to silence. As are the Americans who have died in Iraq, like the son of Andrew Bacevich, killed May 13, 2007.
I think one of the saddest aspects of our Iraq war is how quickly Americans have chosen to forget it. There seems to be an unwillingness on the part of the American people to acknowledge and to confront this enormous failure.
Aggressive deception is totally incompatible with the fundamental principle of democracy.
A failure, the result of a manipulation that has shaken the confidence of Americans in their own institutions. The man who wanted to see the end of Saddam Hussein did not want to see the end of Iraq, and he was sidelined.
An emissary of President Bush told me, if you oppose the policies of President Bush, we will bring the full weight of the United States to bear against you. I knew that the Americans are going to target me. There is a finding of the National Security Council signed by President Bush in April of 2004, entitled Marginalized Chalabi.
10 hours after this interview, Ahmed Chalabi was found dead in his bed. An autopsy concluded it was a heart attack. Saddam Hussein, arrested and judged, is hung December 30th, 2006. George Bush is re-elected in November 2004. Richard Cheney remains vice president. Colin Powell leaves office in January 2005. Condoleezza Rice replaces him at the State Department. George Tenet resigns in July 2004, citing personal reasons. Douglas Feith resigns from the Pentagon in January 2005. Paul Wolfowitz is appointed president of the World Bank in June 2005. Donald Rumsfeld leaves the Pentagon in November 2006. Richard Perle divides his time between Washington and the south of France.
The story has been suppressed, witnesses have been killed, and this is your country, ladies and gentlemen.